Alright, here we go. Welcome back to Barrack Saga for chapter 14. This one, when I first looked at it, seemed pretty scary, but it turned out to be not that bad after all. So, the first thing about chapter 14 is that it takes you away from access to the city shops, so we need to do all of our buying and selling in the end of chapter 13 while we still have that access. And I do this in a particular order to start with. The first thing I do is to go and clear out all these cutscenes, because one of these has an item reward that I want to sell, and I don't want to have to go into the item selling menu twice. So we got that, the You Good Wood that Ward now has, in addition to Reese's new Liga Corso, which we'll get to in a moment. For now, I am doing one big selling spree. Mostly a bunch of useless weapons on units that I don't really care about, but notably I'm also getting rid of my items that heal poison or cripple, because I haven't seen all that much poison recently, and I've never used the Detoxify Orb in particular, and this late in the game, being crippled is no longer a substantial concern. Next up, I move on to inventory management. And the first thing I do here is disable Alvina from active duty, and then proceed to take all of her stuff away and distribute it to other units, because as I mentioned in the last map, Alvina is never going to be deployed again due to no longer having a horse or a super strong personal weapon anymore. There are a few more trades going on, notably a strongbow that Enid got on drop during the last map. But the most significant thing here is Clifford being traded the Night Sword. This was actually a plan that ended up not happening. In the clear, Clifford's role changed away from combat a little bit, so that's unnecessary, but it also didn't screw me over. We're now moving on to buying things. First and foremost, both Volo and Faye are buying a bunch of special swords. They're not necessarily going to be the ones to use these swords, but they pick them up here because they have plenty of inventory space, because I don't think I've used either of them for a while. Clifford buys a number of things. Firstly, I got rid of his Shining Shield because the upcoming map isn't going to have all that many dark mages, and so he needs a replacement, and in this case I picked up a Paladin Shield. I also bought him a pike, because part of the final map has an indoor section, and the pike is only usable by dismounted units, but it gives an extra 2 damage per hex instead of only 1, so I can see myself finding uses for that. I considered buying an Iron Lance for Clifford because his current one is nearly all worn out, but to be honest, his horse is on low HP, and so it's probably not going to be as useful as what I did end up getting. Percival then buys some orbs at the temple. He picks up a Windstorm, which has the same might as Airblade, while hitting 3 times instead of twice, at reduced accuracy. This is probably an improvement to reliability in any case where I need only 1 or 2 hits to get a kill, so that's pretty important. I also buy a Vanish Stone, which has just appeared in this shop, and because both of the Vanish Stones I've obtained previously went on to be extremely useful in some tricky strategies, I also have high hopes for this one, although it doesn't end up getting used in this chapter. Percival also picked up a Lightning Orb, although I honestly think I might have done better to buy him a new Thunder for 2 range, but c'est la vie, this is what we've got to work with. There's actually an extra save point in chapter 14 that I didn't end up saving on. I originally planned to leave this save point available in case, after some testing, I decided that I needed to make some changes to my unit's equipment, or use the stat booster that I have available to me, because I didn't want to have to redo the entire shopping and preps segment that we just finished, but luckily I didn't end up having to do that. So, this map is actually fairly similar to SideQuest 11.1. There is a big cliff with lots of enemies at the top, and we need to make it up there under heavy ballista fire in order to seize the fortress. This is doubly challenging because the ballistae on this map are springolds, which are extremely powerful and extremely accurate, so it's extremely difficult to head up a cliff while taking bolts from that. So what I wound up doing is exploiting a weakness in the springold formation in that they are not all aiming towards where I need to go at the start of the map. This meant that the first move of the chapter had to be Kramer moving into range of the upper left springold, preventing it from turning, as it prefers to instead attack where possible. Kramer is the obvious choice for this because he has Arrowbane, but additionally, unlike Percival, who is the other Arrowbane unit that I have access to, Kramer actually has the concrete durability required to survive a hit from the springolds with 1 HP, and he has a concoction available to heal himself if necessary. On the other side of the map, there are 2 springolds, and Clifford is going to be the one distracting them. He moves into the range of the upper rightmost one on turn 1 in order to keep it from turning southwards, and with his shield, if he activates it, which he usually will thanks to shield there, he is actually capable of taking 2 hits to the face without dying, which is increased to 4 hits with the vulnerary that he is holding on to. An enemy cavalier with sleep arrows targets Faye here. She was put in place to take that sleep arrow and fall asleep, but she actually managed to activate her parry skill, and that means that we can keep moving her forwards. I did this in order to prevent the sleep arrows from targeting Raze later in the map and slowing him down. And once the sleep arrow guy has moved, we can then have Enid move up and target the enemy archer who is inside the fortress. This guy is a real pain in the ass because he's capable of attacking us as we climb the cliffs towards the fortress gate. And as you saw when he attacked Kramer, he also has Deadeye, so he can attack at 3 range. He is extremely lethal towards Enid, so we want to kill him as quickly as possible, but Enid is the only unit that we have who can attack him back over the fortress walls using Earthblaze. So despite the fact that she has sub 60% accuracy, she is the one who gets into a duel with him. And it works out alright because she landed her first hit. Next up, Burrows moves forward, but before he does, he unequips his ballista. This is a slight exploit in the game's code because it allows him to then attack using one of his ballistae after moving, which is something that ballisticians normally aren't able to do. This is one of the 2 contributions that Burrows is going to make on this entire map, and it's followed up by Faramir using his bow to finish off the crossbow enemy that Burrows chipped. This is important because that crossbow guy has Overwatch and would make it a real pain to climb the cliffs for Faramir and Sylvis. Speaking of Faramir and Sylvis, their goal is to get up these cliffs as soon as they can, once it's safe to do so, and beeline towards the lower right ballista in order to kill it. This ballista is tricky to approach because it covers all the approaches towards it naturally without even having to turn. So I have Percival over on this side as a last ditch attempt to get close to it if it's necessary. Fortunately, I never ended up having to put Percival in range, but he can 2-round KO fairly reliably with his Windstorm Tome, so that's most of what he is here for. At this point, we can now move Dean up the cliff to 1-round KO the Cavalier with the sleep arrows, and that eliminates him as a concern for the rest of the map, which is really great for the rest of my strategy. I'm very glad that I managed to figure out the Fey bait on turn 1 there. That's pretty good. And we really needed this to happen because Reese's movement path in this chapter is extremely inflexible and strict. For the first 3 turns of the map, Reese has exactly 1 specific tile that he needs to get onto or else we lose turns. and on these first 3 turns, it's possible for green units to occupy the tile instead. So Raze needs to be pretty careful about moving fairly early in each of those first 3 turns. I'm not always as careful to do this as I probably should have been throughout this clear, but fortunately it wound up working out. Enid attacks the archer again and manages to land her second consecutive sub 60% hit to kill him, and that eliminates the threat from within the fortress by and large, because now in order for anyone to fight us, they have to come out and do it in the open, where we can easily overwhelm them. So that's a pretty good thing done, and makes this group's task a lot easier. It is worth noting at this point that we are by no means alone on this map. There are 2 allied armies in yellow and green who are helping us. The green units are the Borneans, and the yellow units are Narvians. And they are basically there to provide cannon fodder to protect some of our units from taking damage. The only unit I'm actually sending up near there is Raze, so this is an extremely important job that the green and yellow units are very good at. Now, a surprising thing happens at this point. I didn't really expect this to happen, but the lower right Springald actually turns upwards towards Clifford on this turn, and I'm going to take as much advantage of this as possible by moving Clifford in to bait its attacks, and that's going to keep its attention focused on him as my archers and Percival approach it from the now undefended south. This was a genuinely serendipitous strategy, although it still would have worked out because Faramir is able to move in to fight the Springald from within its range within 2 turns either way. Raze is now about to head up onto the cliffs, and I actually forgot to equip his Gram on this turn, which is pretty dangerous because this part of the map is very risky with lots of enemy archers. And the middle ballistician is actually also able to target Raze here, so that's why I wanted to have Gram, just to provide that little bit of extra insurance. The enemy Axe Guard that moved in to fight Larentia here is getting 1 round KO'd by Sherpa. This is another opportunity that I jumped at when I noticed it, because that Axe Guard is pretty bulky usually, and he starts in a position that is dead in the middle of where Raze needs to move in order to reach the seize point in time. So having him out of the way just makes Raze's job easier and easier. We still have a couple of roadblocks to clear out before Raze's path is completely clear though, and I'll get to those in a moment. For now, I would like to point out the 2 enemy healers on this map. They both have Darkmend, and so they are a real pain in the ass. This, combined with the fact that a lot of the enemies have vulneraries, means that oftentimes the green and yellow units will chip an enemy down only for them to heal right back up on the subsequent turn. And that makes the enemies a lot more durable than I'm particularly happy with. But to be fair, from their perspective, it's probably not particularly fair that I'm able to heal up my flyer that they have so much trouble damaging. So maybe it's kind of fair that way. The enemies who were on the right hand side of the map have moved down towards the center, and that allows the right hand group of my units to move up onto the cliffs in earnest now. It's particularly important because Percival in particular has extremely poor durability, so letting him be in range of any enemy who is not subject to Arrowbane means that we run an extremely high chance of him being simply one-hit KO'd, which is something that I really obviously do not want to happen. Sylvis and Faramir also are not the most durable of units, but they can at least take a hit before going down. And Faramir in particular is fairly likely to dodge too. One thing about this chapter is that it is a very long one, and this is largely down to the green and yellow units taking up so much time Even though this map takes less than half the turns that Chapter 13 took me, the video length here is still nearly as long, and that's kind of insane. So even though the green and yellow armies are extremely helpful, I kind of wish that they weren't there or were at least smaller so that there'd be less time wasted. But I can't do much about that, so onward and upward. Burrows has decided that he is done helping. He is instead switching to using Battle Cry every single turn from now on, and that's going to be important near the end of the map. You'll notice that I have been dismounting a fair amount in this map. In particular, Clifford doesn't have to climb any cliffs, so him being dismounted is specifically to prevent the damage he takes from being ballista bait from killing his horse, and thus rendering him unmounted for the final chapter. I have some indecision at this point, and indeed at multiple points throughout this clear, and this is another contributing factor to the length of the clear, because I have to react to things a lot more than I needed to back in the easier, shorter maps. But this particular bit of hesitation eventually leads to me deciding to have Paramithis finish off the enemy crossbow user using her holy sword, because that very conveniently one-hit KOs that guy from where he got healed up to. And so that's a very reliable elimination of another enemy from consideration. Now, some of my allied units have finally reached the top of the cliff and are now able to engage the enemy on more even footing. The ally units are pretty scrubby, but they can generally deal fairly well with the enemy infantry units. However, there are also several enemy cavalry units up the top of the cliff, and these guys are more durable and extremely dangerous. In particular, the sleep arrow one that I killed earlier was important, and there's also a bow cavalier with Raijin arrows, which deal a ton of damage to all of the green and yellow units. So those are very dangerous, and they make it pretty tricky for the green and yellow units to maintain their foothold. Larentia is now moving in on the central ballistician. As I mentioned earlier, this guy can target Raze as he makes his way up the cliff, which is bad, and he's also been one-hit KOing the allied units, one per turn, and that means that we have less fodder to make it to the top of the cliff. So I want to kill this ballistician as soon as possible, and Larentia is the best way to get in there without being targeted and completely destroyed. The other reason for dealing with this ballistician is that he's also sitting right where Raze needs to move through. So that's one less enemy for Raze to worry about once we manage to finish him off on the next turn. It would be pretty easy for Larentia to die where she's sitting now if the enemies actually wanted to target her, but the AI generally tends to go for the weaker green and yellow units over any of my blue units, and I ruthlessly exploit this wherever I can. Clifford is actually managing to get some dodges against the enemy Springold shots, and this ends up pretty necessary now that he is distracting 2 Springolds instead of just the one that I expected him to face. Fortunately, Faramir is now within range of the southern one, and he is going to walk up there and easily one-hit KO using his mithril arrows. Unfortunately, the more accurate arrows are not sufficient to one-hit KO, and I wanted to go for the one-hit KO, but unfortunately that happens. Faramir misses a really high percent hit, and so it might have been better for me to try and go for the lower damage but higher accuracy over 2 turns. I can't really say that for sure, but you know, Faramir definitely isn't going to be missing the second time he tries that, obviously. I mean, how could that possibly happen? That's just complete nonsense, right? Paramithis gets attacked again here, and she counters with Pursuit, and this breaks her Holy Sword. And if you pay careful attention throughout the rest of this map, you'll notice that I never actually have her re-equip a weapon, so she just stands there and gets repeatedly attacked by some enemies and doesn't do anything in response. As I mentioned earlier, the red units seem to prefer going for the green and yellow units fairly often, but I still do my best to make sure that Percival is not in range of anything that could reasonably hit him, because it's much better to be safe than rely on AI quirks that may not even be consistent. Raze moves up to the top of the cliff here, and I finally switch him to Grom, because he is going to use Grom to finish off an enemy who's also at the top of the cliff. I tried my best to time Raze's movement so that he could pick up kills like this, because the more enemies he's able to kill with his very strong Grom, the fewer enemies remain to get in his way potentially later on. I'm quite glad that there was an enemy with 1 HP here, so that the Darkmen healer would heal them rather than healing the ballistician that Larentia has chipped down to below half HP. It would have been pretty awkward if that had happened and Larentia would have needed more attacks later on. And now, this Imperial Knight kills a green unit and then cantos somewhere very dangerous, and he's going to regret that in a moment, because he is now in range of Sylvis, and she is about to whip out a secret weapon that I've been holding on to for quite some time, and that is the second broadhead arrow that I managed to capture way back in chapter 3. So Sylvis is going to shoot that guy with this arrow, and that deletes his horse and makes him much more manageable. Technically, Sylvis is now at risk from doing this because she's in range of the other Imperial Knight, but it's okay because she's perfectly capable of taking one hit. I certainly wouldn't be trying this with Percival. It's now time to turn our attention to breaking down yet another 100 HP gate, hopefully the last in the entire game. And Sherpa doesn't have his Brim Ranger anymore, so no 3 hits against it, but the Zweihander still manages to deal a huge chunk in just 2 hits. And Enid is then capable of moving in to target the gate at 2 range with her Earth Blaze, and that also does a pretty decent chunk of damage. It's important to leave the gate intact on this turn, for reasons which I'll get into shortly. Now, I mentioned earlier that most of the ally units are scrubs, but there are actually a couple of pretty good ones. One in particular has a Knight Sword, so he's fairly good at getting up to the top and dealing a decent amount of damage to the enemies up there. So that's pretty helpful when he finally manages to climb to the top of the cliffs, and we'll see several rounds of combat with him later on as well. Dean whips out Desperation to get 100% accuracy to finish off the last remaining enemy that's threatening our Western group. And so pretty much the only enemy that the Western group needs to deal with now is the Ballistician that Larentia is handling, and the rest of them can focus on breaking down the gate and then getting in towards the boss. Clifford moves out of the second ballista's range to just hold the attention of the uppermost ballista now. He could have stayed where he was if Faramir had just managed to hit, but at this point we don't need to bait the attention of the southern one, because by the time it turns around, Faramir will have had a second go and obviously, definitely, certainly 100% hit it and killed it at that point. So that's pretty good. As I mentioned earlier, Sylvis is in range of the enemy Imperial Knight, and she gets hit for a decent amount of damage. And this is actually unfortunate. Because of the way that the Imperial Knights are stacked up against her, she's fairly safe from being attacked as long as she doesn't move. But if she does move, then the dismounted Imperial Knight will probably target her and finish her off. So she needs to sit there until the Imperial Knight makes his move, which is not going to happen for a little bit. Laurentia finishes off the ballistician at this stage. She's been using throw for the extra plus 10 accuracy. This does mean that she doesn't keep the Verutum equipped, so she can't counter enemies attacking her at one range, but the plus 10 hit is much more important for her for killing off this ballistician as reliably as possible. Although I then do have some indecision as to where to canto Laurentia, because I need to put her in a place where if she gets attacked by an enemy, said enemy will not be blocking the way for Raze. And so I eventually decide to just pop her straight down, but there was some question there, which is why it took me so long to decide. Now, I should note at this point that Kramer is sitting in range of the ballistician and relying pretty much exclusively on his natural avoid and arrowbane. And he has a method of increasing his reliability just sitting there in his inventory in the form of the Balmung, which, as you're probably aware by now in this run, gives him the parry skill. I actually intended to have him equip Balmung for this purpose, but then when I actually started the map, I had a bit of a brain fart and left him with the Levin sword equipped, because that gave him a little bit of extra avoid compared to the Balmung. This is probably actually for the best, because Balmung is actually getting fairly worn down at this point, and parry would have eaten its durability up. And also Kramer actually did manage to get arrowbane enough to dodge all of the ballista shots, so it ended up not being all that important, and that means that I get as much Balmung with durability to go into the final map as I possibly can. I eventually decide to wait with Kramer here in order to force the enemy turn to advance a bit, because none of the units who I really want to move can move yet due to inconvenient enemy positioning. But in particular, Raze was blocked by an enemy crossbow unit, but that guy is about to move out of the way and use a vulnerary, and so Raze is now able to move ahead. And once again, the enemy AI movement offered me a serendipitous opportunity. In this case, the enemy healer is right next to where Raze needed to move to, so I was able to kill him and take away half of the enemy's healing resources. At this point, I'm fairly sure that most of the enemies have used up any vulneraries that they have lying around, and so from now on, most of the damage that lands on an enemy unit from either my units or the allied units is going to be permanent, and that's pretty good, although there is still that one inaccessible Darkmen healer inside the castle that we need to worry about later on. The dismounted Imperial Knight now goes for Raze, and this is actually the only combat that Raze sees in this entire map, which is absolutely hilarious given how long he was in range of Springold for. Raze manages to chunk him for quite a bit of damage thanks to Graham's plus effect, and thanks to a shield block, Raze himself took minimal damage. So I think that worked out pretty well, and with the Imperial Knight now out of the way, Sylvis can move over to finish off the ballistician with 100% hit, after Percival weakened him using his windstorm. And I actually completely missed pointing it out, but they had to do this because Faramir did in fact miss his second nearly 80% hit against the ballistician. Dude, it's a stationary ballista, how did you miss twice? Anyway, disappointing results from Faramir aside, this means that we're now pretty safe, and Clifford, in fact, is also finished distracting the uppermost ballista. He mounts and moves well out of the way. This is completely fine because the northern ballistician that he was originally distracting is turned too far north to deal any damage to any of my units anywhere they might want to be for the remainder of the map, which is pretty nice. We now break down the gate, I delayed doing this until quite late in the turn because the remaining Imperial Heavy Gunner sitting inside the castle actually also has sleep arrows, and I did not want to give him the opportunity to put my units to sleep. The demolition of the gate heralds the arrival of the first boss of this map. This is Piers, and he is a general with extremely high defensive power. But thanks to the secret weapon that I bought for Dean before the map, he is going to be extremely easy to kill. Enid moves up and shows the sleep arrow guy what the palace lair is made of, but I actually put her in the wrong place here. This is an extremely minor error, the only result of which is that Dean kills the boss one turn later than I had planned. But you see that I am a little worried here, and Dean ends up moving fewer spaces than his maximum movement towards the boss here. With the gate down, Piers is now the only enemy standing between Raze and the seize point, so we are going to deal with him as quickly as possible. Of my other units, only Enid can really deal significant damage to him, so it's best for us to leave this to Dean, even if he is a little delayed. At this point, Vester and Van Million both have a little cutscene as they start to move towards the enemy. They have been sitting at the back waiting for their cannon fodder to deal as much damage as possible, but now they're finally on the move, and they're going to be almost no help at all because they are far too late. It's actually a little sad because Vester was a lot of help back in chapter 12 when we had him as a blue unit, but as a green unit he just doesn't do anything. Notably, if either of these two die, that's a game over, but it's extremely unlikely to happen, especially in a clear as fast as this one. So this is turn 5, we've had our save point, and the first thing we need to do here is move Dean in towards the boss. Another reason why I wanted to have that space not occupied by Dean on the previous turn was that that's actually where Raze wants to move to. So moving Dean out of the way frees it up for Raze to then go there. Sylvis was standing around on low HP within range of an Imperial Knight, but I figured it was completely fine to do this because I had the save point to fall back on if I needed to rig a miss, but fortunately for me, that guy didn't even bother going for Sylvis, instead preferring to go over and kill a green unit in the center of the map, long after it matters, because Raze has now slipped past the enemies and is capable of moving into the objective. And he is going to mount up now and get his revenge on the Imperial Knight who dared to attack him. This is also completely safe thanks to the save point. Raze managed to get a dodge here, saving this particular run, but I could have just reset and gotten a more favorable outcome. And this means Raze didn't take damage, and so he's still able to canto ahead his full 8 tiles towards the seize point. And because this is turn 5, Kramer is also finished distracting the enemy ballistician, and he's done a very good job of it. As I noted earlier, he did not take a single hit throughout this run, so he actually managed to save us a concoction there. It's notable that for some reason, enemy ballisticians are not able to turn more than 1 hex distance at a time, and that is why the upper right ballistician is not able to threaten us at all, despite it having 2 turns to turn around to face us. This one, of course, would have had to use its final turn to turn anyway, thanks to how long Kramer was distracting it, so that's not an issue here. My archers are now moving into their positions for the final phase of this map, and Faramir unequips his mithril arrows. This is because he needs to trade those to Sylvis. This actually proved to be unnecessary, as you'll see, but the plan was to maximize Sylvis's potential damage as much as possible, and Faramir is instead going to receive sniper arrows to make him as accurate as possible. They're positioning themselves to be as close as possible to where the actual boss of this map is about to spawn. Interestingly, the enemy healer walks right up to the space where said boss will spawn, and I was a little bit worried about this for a moment because I had no idea what was going to happen and whether the boss was going to spawn in a different spot, which could have been awkward. Dean is, as always, super awesome. He gets attacked by a regular enemy, but he procs Vengeful and one-hit KOs the guy straight through a shield. He has now taken damage, which is a small problem because he does still need to take a hit from the boss, but that's okay, we have ways of dealing with this. So Sylvis moves up next to Faramir and they swap arrows. Faramir had to unequip the mithril arrows to do this trade because you cannot trade equipped weapons or items off an ally, and that includes arrows. And Sylvis then uses her turn in an attempt to get a critical hit to kill the enemy healer. This didn't actually go off, but it turned out to be unnecessary, and it's very funny what actually happens to that guy. The enemies that are not reinforcements to the north of the fortress do not seem to move in to attack us, even as we get really close to the throne. Presumably they are just there to prevent you from attacking and killing the northern Springald, but because we distracted it, we didn't need to worry about that at all. I did my best with my other units to wall off the reinforcements from coming through the gate, but I didn't do it very well. There is still a space for them to sneak through. In order to completely wall off this gate, what I should have done was have all 3 units stand directly next to it, and that would have prevented any 0 or 1 range units from coming through to attack it, because they could not stand in the gate space. However, I think I was a little concerned about being targeted by the enemy archers, because I wasn't completely certain of their AI. So instead we get this half-assed version. I also didn't bother attacking with Enid's Earthblaze because there's really no point in trying to get any more kills. The map is basically done anyway, as we are now starting turn 6. So the first thing to do here is have Paramithus move up and heal Dean, and this gets him good and ready for his big clash with the first boss of the map. And then after that 1 unit move, we have to sit through a substantial number of enemy and ally movements. They are having their own big battle back at the cliff top that I left behind with all of my units a long time ago. And at this stage, they are just wasting my time, and I'm a little bit bored with it, but you gotta give them their fun. There have been some funny moments, like one of these red units being on 1 HP and dodging a ridiculous amount of would-be lethal hits. That's very amusing to watch if you feel like going back to check it out. But they're pretty much done, and it's time for me to get my second unit move of this turn. And so obviously Dean is going to go straight up to Piers and fight him. And he's using Desperation so that he gets 2 hits. And he's using his new weapon, which is the hammer. In this game, the hammer completely ignores the defenses of any armored units. So since Piers is a general, he doesn't get any benefit from his high defense or his shield, and Dean just effortlessly 1-round KOs him. And that leaves the fort open for Raze to move in and seize, and this causes the actual boss of the map, Gordova, to appear, alongside Lynette, who has been brainwashed into fighting alongside him. So that's your Karga special there, and all we need to do to finish the job is to make sure that Gordova gets killed. So the first unit I have lined up to attack him is Burrows. He has been building up attack and accuracy for the entire map through Battlecry, and if he had managed to reach level 7 by this point, he would also have aim, which is why I moved him up at the very start of the map to demonstrate that it would have been possible to use that to get him up to 100% accuracy. But fortunately his 80-ish is enough to get the hit, and he deals an enormous amount of damage to get Gordova started. Faramir follows up with a sniper arrow for maximum accuracy while using the full durability strongbow rather than his composite bow, which is getting worn down. Gordova has counter, so it has to be Faramir next because he is able to take a hit from the boss's Tumahan. This orb is super nasty because it doesn't just damage your HP, but also your experience. So Faramir ends up losing 29 EXP from this combat, which is kind of painful. Anyway, that just leaves Sylvis, who I thought I might need to use mithril arrows to get the kill, but it turned out she didn't need to, so I pick the Iron Arrow Plus for the extra plus 10 hit. And she of course has aim, also for more accuracy, and that finishes Gordova off. And if you were paying attention, you'll have noticed Gordova appeared exactly where I expected him to, and in the process, the enemy healer completely disintegrated. He vanished completely from the map, which is pretty funny. Anyway, that is chapter 14, completed in 6 turns, and I will see you next time for the grand finale.